Welcome to AP Biology. Today I want to go over the details of photosynthesis with you. So you can see up here the equation for photosynthesis. It takes carbon dioxide and water, some light energy, and the plants are able to make glucose with that, and oxygen is a nice waste product because we can use it. But the photosynthesis is actually split into two major parts. There are the light-dependent reactions, and then later the Calvin cycle, which is the light-independent reactions. So if you look at these light-dependent reactions, plants take water and they use light to split the water and bump up the electrons that are donated from water to give them more energy. And when water's split, it releases hydrogen and oxygen. That oxygen is a waste product. So in the light reactions, you might notice there's no carbon at all. So for the light reactions, you take water and light energy and produce oxygen. So notice that we haven't said anything at all about carbon. So carbon dioxide hasn't come into play yet, and sugar hasn't come into play yet. They're not going to be talked about until we get to the Calvin cycle. We'll talk about them there. But today I want to go over the light-dependent reactions. And so, so the overall gist of what's happening is that light splits water. The electrons from water are put onto a delivery molecule called NADP+, which gets reduced to NADPH. You set up a proton gradient just like you did with cellular respiration, and with chemiosmosis, you're able to make some ATP. So these folks are the middlemen, NADPH and ATP. The cell can go ahead and use ATP now if it wants, but typically it's going to change that ATP into sugar. So we'll talk about that later. Today we're just going to talk about the light reactions. So the light reactions happen if you're a eukaryote, like a plant, or a protist. The light reactions will happen in the thylakoid membranes. So thylakoid is something that you should memorize. It's these little stacks of proteins in here, little stacks of membranes in here, and they have proteins in them, in the membranes. They have pigments in them. So the light-dependent reactions use light, and it occurs across the thylakoid membranes if you're a eukaryote. If you're a prokaryote, it just happens in your only membrane, your cell membrane. Okay, so here's what it looks like. If you look inside of a chloroplast, here's the chloroplast. It's a double membraned organelle. What we want to focus on, though, are the thylakoids. So if you look at one of those thylakoid membranes, that's what this is. And so you can see the phospholipid bilayer that we always see in any membrane, whether it's the cell membrane or some inner membrane. So this is the thylakoid. Light enters the leaves, and it hits this photosystem. The photosystems have pigments in them. The pigments can accept the photon and bump an electron up to a higher energy level. That electron will go through an electron transport chain right here. So this is the electron transport chain of cellular respiration. And so the electrons don't come with much energy. The energy comes from the light. But light, travels through a vacuum, right? Light isn't physically, it's just electromagnetic radiation, right? So it's a moving magnetic field that causes a moving electric field that causes a magnetic, etc. So the electrons themselves physically have to come from something. They come from water. Water split in half. The electrons will go through here. The protons will stay here inside the thylakoid space. So this is the thylakoid space right inside. And then oxygen's just a waste product, so the oxygen will go away. So in cellular respiration, the very end of the electron transport chain had oxygen taking electrons. In photosynthesis, it's opposite. The very beginning has water giving up electrons to release oxygen. The energy that's lost as the electrons move through is used to pump protons, just like you saw in cellular respiration. And so here are the protons being pumped into the thylakoid space. You get a proton gradient in here, just like you saw with cellular respiration. So you get a proton gradient. Proton gradient. And so those protons come out through ATP synthase here and produce ATP. The ATP doesn't require oxygen to be made, right? This whole process actually requires light. So instead of calling it oxidative phosphorylation, we're going to call this photophosphorylation. Photo because it's light, phosphorylation because the molecule ATP synthase is phosphorylating ADP with this phosphate to make ATP. So it's called photophosphorylation. Wow, you'll have to forgive my writing today. I don't have my writing pad with me. Okay, so this is photosystem 2. And it has some chlorophyll A in it. Here's photosystem 1. I'll talk about this very briefly in a little bit as well. And it has chlorophyll B in it. I don't think I would memorize that, but there are 2 different photosystems, which means 2 different groups of pigments with an electron acceptor. So what happens? Light hits into the accessory molecules, the accessory pigments, and then to chlorophyll, and it excites an electron. So first, photosystem 2, I'm sorry that it's photosystem 2, but that's how it is. So photosystem 2 absorbs light energy, oops, sorry, that was backwards, and bumps an electron, 2 electrons actually, up to a more distant energy level. So there are the electrons getting bumped up to a more distant energy level in their atom. They're not physically sent like in a direction that way. This is just showing you a graph of energy of electrons. So the electrons have energy, and then they have to be replaced. They're replaced from water. So far, what we're looking at is right here. The electrons are energized and passed to the electron transport chain. These are proteins in the thylakoid membrane inside the chloroplast that can accept and donate electrons. So this is your electron transport chain, and then we're going to have another photosystem with another small electron transport chain. The lost electrons are replaced from the splitting of water, which releases hydrogens inside the thylakoid membrane, and then just oxygen as a waste product. So the electrons physically come from water, but they get their energy from light. Okay, so we've bumped up the electrons, and then we need another electron there, and so we get that from water. So here's water. When you break water, you have oxygen as a waste product. You have electrons that can go through the electron transport chain, and then hydrogens that get stuck inside the thylakoid membrane. So here's what water looks like, H2O, and it has some oxygen. It'll actually put 2 of them together to make oxygen gas. And then, so the water has oxygen and it also has 2 hydrogens. These are the hydrogens. Remember, hydrogens are atoms that are made out of 1 proton and 1 electron. So the oxygen goes away. That's good for us. And the hydrogens, remember, are made out of both electrons and protons. These will go through the electron transport chain. And these will go inside the thylakoid membrane. So here's the thylakoid membrane in the chloroplast, and this is where the hydrogens will build up, the protons, the hydrogen ions. Whoops, actually that's a better picture of it, isn't it? So here's a chloroplast, that's a thylakoid, and the thylakoid ends up getting hydrogen ions in it, both because they're pumped there and because they're left there when water is split. So this is just a couple of them. Remember, inside here you have a lot of hydrogen ions, which make the whole thing acidic, which means you have a low pH, right? Here's ATP synthase, and when the hydrogen ions come out, this proton gradient is released through ATP synthase, and you make ATP. Coolio! Again, that's photophosphorylation because you need light energy. You don't use oxygen. Okay, so as the electrons move through the electron transport chain, you're able to pump these protons into the inner compartment, into this thylakoid space in here. As the electrons get pumped from molecule to molecule to molecule, as they get, maybe I should say it a different way, as the electrons move from one to the next, to the next, to the next, right? One carrier to the next, they actually lose energy. So this is showing you the energy of electrons. Light gives them quite a bit of energy here. But then as they move down from like this is the most electronegative, right? As they go to more and more electronegative carrier proteins, they get held more tightly and they lose energy. That energy, that energy is used to pump protons into the thylakoid membrane, right? When the protons come out through ATP synthase, they're able to make ATP, just like you saw with cellular respiration. Whoa! So there's the chloroplast. Thank you. All that ATP. Okay, the ATP is used later. You can use it now if you're a plant right away if you want to, but you also use that later to make sugars, which can store the energy, the chemical energy, for a longer period of time than ATP can. Okay, so they don't have much energy there. They don't even have, by the time they go through the electron transport chain, they actually don't have much energy left anymore. So there's a second photosystem that's called photosystem 1. Anyway, you need a little bit more light actually to bump them up to a higher energy level so that they can be pulled off eventually. So here's some more light. That's going to bump the electrons up again, and then they're going to go through a shorter electron transport chain. And I'm going to split some more. So the electrons from here actually came from here, which came from here, which came from here, right? So originally they came from water, but they're just going through these electron transport carriers now. Okay, so then what happens? Well, there's another electron transport chain, and finally NADP plus takes the electrons, becomes NADPH, and this is used later to reduce carbon dioxide, to make glucose. Coolio, right? And then you use that later in the light-independent reactions. The electrons will be used later, to put it on carbon dioxide, right? Because carbon dioxide doesn't have hydrogens, but glucose does, right? C6H12O6. So the hydrogens come from the proton and the electron that NADH gives them. All right. So this whole electron transport thing sets up a proton gradient. So this sets up an electrochemical gradient, which is used to produce ATP. This is still called chemiosmosis because the protons are going from high concentration here out to low concentration here. When the hydrogen ions move through ATP synthase, they twist the molecule just like you saw in cellular respiration. ATP made this way is called photophosphorylation because you need light and you don't need oxygen. So the final electron acceptor is NADP+. It's a delivery molecule. It'll bring electrons to the carbon cycle. NADPH and ATP are used to reduce carbon dioxide and also to add energy in order to make glucose. We'll talk about that when we talk about the light-independent reactions. And here's a summary of the whole thing. Making ATP, that's the first, and the NADPH, that's the first major step of photosynthesis. That's the light reactions. Should we go through the whole thing? Why not? Here's some light energy. The light energy is used to split water to get electrons and to bump those electrons up to a higher energy level. Well, first it bumps the electrons up to a higher energy level. And then the water split, which produces oxygen. Almost have to go. There's the oxygen. Sets up a proton gradient, which is then used in chemiosmosis to make ATP. Photophosphorylation. Then you need some more light to bump the electrons up again so that you can reduce NADP and make NADPH. Those are electrons we'll use later. So we have talked about the light-independent reactions. Now we have ATP and NADPH, which can go on and reduce carbon in the light-independent reactions. The energy conversions, last thing here. Light energy is converted to electrical potential energy as you have those protons built up in here, and then that's converted to chemical energy when plants make ATP. So lots of really cool energy conversions, right? Light energy converted to electrical potential energy, converted to chemical potential energy. All the cool stuff, I think, really happens in the light-dependent reactions. And so remember, you can't do photosynthesis without light. Last thing here. If you use a radioactive tracer, you can see that the oxygen in water goes to oxygen. So the oxygen that you breathe came originally from water. The oxygen in CO2 does not end up in oxygen that we breathe. So it's actually the oxygen in water. Prove that oxygen came from water, not carbon dioxide. Remember, everything that you learn in any science class came from a scientist who did a really amazing experiment, or maybe a whole bunch of really amazing experiments.